At 25 kilometers above the Earth, the aircraft known as Ghost Sparrow moved through the stratosphere like a silent arrow of steel, slicing through layers of thin, icy air. The sky outside was not the deep blue of normal flight altitude. Up here, it was nearly black, the curve of the planet faintly visible beyond the window glass. Passengers gazed in awe at the rare view, unaware that in less than a minute, everything would change. The hum of the engines was steady, smooth, almost soothing. Aria sat in seat 14F, her fingers pressed against the cold window as she stared at the endless darkness above. She loved that view. It reminded her of the nights she spent with her father at the flight club, where he would point at the sky and explain how aircraft navigated through invisible air currents. She admired every word he spoke. Aviation wasn't just a subject to her, it was her world. The seat belt light blinked softly overhead. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, collecting cups and smiling gently at the passengers. Everything felt perfectly normal, perfectly calm. Until the calm suddenly shattered. The Ghost Sparrow shuddered violently, a sudden jolt like a giant invisible hand had slammed into its side. A few passengers gasped, gripping their armrests. The engines groaned, an unnatural, grinding noise that did not belong anywhere on a commercial flight. Even Aria, despite her knowledge, had never heard something so ominous. Then it happened. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing," and just like that, the voice vanished. Cut off mid-sentence. Not a click, not a fade, just silence. A horrifying, absolute silence. A strange pressure filled the cabin, followed by a sharp metallic clang from under the floor panels. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. But the engines did not steady. Their roar climbed into a high, desperate scream, the kind that made the windows vibrate. The plane lurched downward. A child began to cry. Someone shouted, "What's happening?" Another voice tried to answer but faltered in fear. The air masks fell from the ceiling with a loud snap, swinging wildly on their wires. Dozens of alarms erupted throughout the aircraft like angry bells. Aria's heart slammed against her ribs. She grabbed her mask, securing it tightly over her nose and mouth. Her breathing echoed inside the plastic cup. She tried to stay calm, counting her breaths the way her father had taught her during turbulence drills. But this wasn't turbulence. This was something else. Something worse. Passengers began to panic. A woman screamed for her husband. An elderly man fumbled with his mask, hands trembling too much to secure it. A teenager called for a flight attendant, but none appeared. The aisle lights blinked red, signaling emergency mode. Aria's mind raced faster than her heartbeat. Her father had drilled her on unusual events, engine failures, cabin decompressions, hydraulic issues, but this didn't match any single scenario. Multiple alarms, silence from the cockpit, erratic engine behavior, this meant there was a catastrophic systems failure. Something major had happened up front. The plane tilted sharply to the left, throwing drinks and small bags from the tray tables. Aria braced herself, gripping the armrests tightly, but her eyes stayed focused. She wasn't scared, she was analyzing. That was how she had been trained. Her father always said fear was normal, but analysis saved lives. She watched the overhead display screen flicker with altitude data. It dropped, slowly at first, then more rapidly. The autopilot was no longer controlling the descent properly. The aircraft was falling. Her chest tightened, not from lack of oxygen but from realization. No. One was flying the plane. A man in a business suit stumbled out of his seat and ran toward the front, shouting for help, but the aisle lights pulsed a warning that the cockpit was locked. The flight attendants were nowhere to be seen. They must have been securing equipment or dealing with emergencies at the rear. The aircraft suddenly lost altitude again, this time violently enough to toss unbelted passengers up from their seats. A food cart rolled backward and crashed into a wall with a deafening clang. Aria felt her stomach lurch. She knew she had seconds, maybe minutes, before the situation became unrecoverable. She inhaled deeply through the mask, her mind envisioning the cockpit controls, the panels, the emergency override system. She had trained for this. Not in real aircraft, of course, she was only 13, but her father trusted her enough to let her spend hundreds of hours on advanced simulators. She knew how to stabilize a falling aircraft. She knew what to do when the main controls became unresponsive. And she knew what those alarms meant, even from here. Someone had to help, and the only person on board who knew anything about flying was her. Her legs shook as she unbuckled herself. The cabin tilted again, but she steadied herself with the seatbacks. Passengers stared at her as she moved down the aisle, some crying, some praying, all too terrified to question where she was going. "Sit down. It's dangerous," a man shouted. Aria shook her head, her voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "The pilots aren't responding." "How do you know?" he yelled back, panic sharpening his words. She didn't answer. She didn't have time. Another jolt hit the plane, ceiling panels rattled, and more alarms screamed in warning. Aria pushed forward, gripping seats as the aircraft rocked around her. The aisle seemed endless, every step a battle against the forces pulling the plane downward. She finally reached the front, where the cockpit door stood like a silent guardian. The flight attendant's jump seat was empty, oxygen mask dangling. A sign of chaos inside. Aria pressed her ear against the cockpit door. No voices. No movement. Nothing. A chill went through her. She knew the protocol. When pilots were incapacitated, the door could be opened with an emergency code, but only by authorized crew. She was not authorized. But she also knew something her father had told her in confidence. During full system failures, the emergency override sometimes released the lock automatically. She reached for the handle. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility forcing itself upon her. She pulled. Nothing. She pulled again, harder. This time, she heard a faint click. One more pull, and the door cracked open slightly. She pushed with all her strength. The door swung inward. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Both pilots were slumped forward, unconscious, their hands limp over the controls. The control yoke trembled violently with the aircraft's descent. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in a frantic red glow. The navigation panel flashed multiple errors. The altimeter was spinning downward with alarming speed. The captain's oxygen mask hung uselessly beside him. The co-pilot's head was tilted awkwardly against the panel. Whatever had happened, it hit them both instantly. Aria stepped inside, the enormity of the cockpit swallowing her small frame. She gently shook the captain's shoulder. No response. She checked the co-pilot. Still nothing. Her breath trembled inside her mask. For a moment, she stood frozen, not in fear, but in the realization that she was utterly, completely alone at the controls of a massive aircraft falling through the sky. But then her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Aria, if something goes wrong, don't think, act. Pilots don't freeze. Pilots fight." She slid into the captain's seat. Her hands fit awkwardly on the large yoke, but she wrapped her fingers around it as if she had always belonged there. She scanned the panels, absorbing every flashing warning, every number, every sound. The aircraft was entering a dangerous descent rate. The left engine temperature was spiking. Cabin pressure was unstable. Autopilot had disengaged itself. Her pulse pounded in her ears. But her mind, her trained, disciplined mind, was calm. She flipped the manual override switch. The controls resisted at first, shaking violently, but she held on. The aircraft responded minimally, just a small correction, barely noticeable, but enough to tell her that she had some control. Not much, but enough to try. The plane dipped again, violently enough to make the co-pilot's headset fall from his ear. Alarms blared like angry sirens, and a loud, grinding noise echoed from the left wing. Aria took a breath. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "You can do this." She tightened her grip on the controls and began the impossible task of saving the Ghost Sparrow from the sky. Aria pushed through the cramped aisle as the aircraft lurched violently, sending oxygen masks swaying like ghosts in a storm. Panicked screams filled the cabin, blending with the unending alarm sirens that echoed from every direction. Her small hands slid along the backs of seats as she forced herself forward, heart thundering but her mind razor-focused. She had trained for emergencies, but nothing like this, nothing this real, nothing this loud, nothing this terrifying. Still, she moved on, step after step, until she stood before the cockpit door, the barrier between life and disaster. She reached for the handle but found it locked, the metallic surface vibrating from the violent shaking of the aircraft. The door felt like it weighed 1,000 kilos as she pulled, her breath sharp inside the oxygen mask pressed to her face. For a second, she feared it wouldn't open, that she was too late, too weak, too young. But then a soft click broke through the chaos. The emergency override had kicked in. She pulled again, harder, and with a shudder the door cracked open. She shoved her shoulder against it until the gap widened enough for her to slip through. The moment she stepped into the cockpit, the world seemed to stop. The red glow of flashing warning lights bathed everything in a hellish hue. The constant beeping stabbed into her ears. And there, slumped over their controls like broken mannequins, were the pilots. The captain's head hung forward, his chin pressed to his chest, while the co-pilot's cheek rested against the cold instrument panel. Their oxygen masks dangled unused beside them, swaying slightly from the violent movements of the aircraft. Aria's stomach twisted. Both of them were completely unconscious. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she felt the sting of fear rise like a wave inside her chest. But she swallowed it down. This wasn't the time for fear. Her father had taught her that fear could be felt, but never followed. She had to act, and she had to act now. She darted forward, gripping the captain's shoulder and shaking him with all her might. "Captain, wake up. Please wake up." But his body remained limp, unmoving. She turned to the co-pilot, shaking him desperately, her voice cracking. "Sir, please." Nothing. No response. Their skin looked pale, their breathing shallow. Something had taken them out instantly. Some failure, some system collapse, something she didn't yet understand. The plane swayed sharply to the left, nearly throwing her off her feet. She grabbed the back of the captain's seat, steadying herself as the aircraft dipped dangerously. Through the windshield she saw only darkness and streaks of thin clouds rushing past. They were descending far too fast. Her eyes darted to the control panels. Warning lights flashed everywhere. The autopilot was off. Altitude decreasing. Engine 2 overheating. Engine 1 at unstable thrust. Flight path deviation flashing in bright red. The aircraft was drifting, losing control, and if no one acted, it would fall. She moved the captain's arm aside gently and slid into the seat, her feet barely reaching the pedals. Her hands, small, trembling, but determined, wrapped around the yoke. She felt its vibrations, the resistance of a massive jet struggling for balance. Her heart pounded in her throat. But she knew these controls. She knew how they worked. She had practiced them again and again on simulators that felt so real she sometimes forgot they weren't actual aircraft. Her father always said she had talent, instinct. And now, sitting in a real cockpit for the first time, she prayed he had been right. She took one deep breath, steadying the tremor in her fingers. The air tasted metallic inside her oxygen mask, each breath cold and sharp. Her feet pressed lightly on the rudder pedals. She flicked her eyes across the panels, scanning through the flashing chaos. She knew she needed control, manual control. Her hand reached for the manual override. For a split second, she hesitated. This was real, not a simulation, not practice. Lives depended on what she did next. Hundreds of lives. But hesitating any longer meant all those lives would be lost. She flipped the switch. The cockpit shook violently as the system shifted control, and the yoke jerked forward, resisting her grip. It felt like the aircraft fought her for authority. But she held on, tightening her fingers, grounding herself in every lesson her father had ever taught her. The screens flickered. Numbers stabilized slightly. The override had taken effect. She had control. Not full control. She could feel the aircraft still pulling, still drifting, still fighting, but partial control, enough to begin stabilizing. Enough to keep the plane from plummeting. The engines wailed, their pitch rising and falling like distressed animals. She felt the vibrations through the floor, through the pedals, through the metal core of the yoke. The left engine fluctuated dangerously, its thrust uneven. The right appeared slightly better, but still unstable. She needed to reduce the descent rate. If she pulled too hard, they would stall. Too soft, and they would continue dropping too fast. Her breath grew short as she focused, her entire world narrowing to the controls in front of her. She applied gentle back pressure on the yoke, feeling the aircraft resist, groaning under the strain. The nose lifted slightly. Not much, just a fraction of the degree she hoped for. But it was enough to tell her she was doing something right. Her eyes flicked to the altitude reading. It was dropping slower now. Still too fast, but slower. She pressed a button on the comm panel. Hello. This is someone in the cockpit. Pilots are unconscious. The plane is descending. Someone, please respond. Static hissed back at her. The radio was malfunctioning. She tried again, switching frequencies one by one. Mayday. Mayday. Ghost Sparrow, pilots incapacitated, I need help. After several attempts, a faint crackle answered her. Ghost Sparrow, identify. Who is? The voice faded, lost in static, the signal too weak to stay connected at this altitude. She felt a wave of helplessness crash over her chest, but she forced it back. She couldn't rely on external help. She had to rely on herself. She tightened her grip, adjusting the throttle gently to stabilize the engines. The left one sputtered, causing the plane to tilt again. She corrected it with careful pressure on the right pedal. Every movement she made was small, controlled, precise, just like her father had taught her. Never jerk the controls, he would always say. Airplanes don't like sudden changes. Treat them gently, even in emergencies. Outside, the thin upper atmosphere clouds whipped past, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Stars shimmered above like silver dust scattered across a velvet sky. The earth below was dark, peaceful, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding high above. Her hands were sweating inside her gloves. She blinked hard to clear her eyes, forcing herself to ignore the shakiness in her limbs. She checked on the pilots again, they were still unconscious. She wished they would wake up, take over, rescue her from this impossible responsibility. But neither of them moved, their bodies frighteningly still. She turned back to the controls. A sharp alarm blared suddenly, engine 2 overheat. Aria's stomach dropped. She scanned the temperature readings. The numbers were climbing rapidly. If the engine overheated any further, it could explode, or shut down entirely. She had studied engine failures in simulations, but never with a left-engine bias aircraft already half uncontrollable. She reduced throttle on engine 2. The temperature dropped slightly, but now the aircraft struggled to maintain lift on the left side. She pressed harder on the right rudder pedal to balance the yaw. The yoke vibrated aggressively in her hands, as if trying to rip itself free. You're okay, she whispered to the plane, almost like calming a wild animal. Stay with me, just stay with me. Her breath fogged the inside of her mask. She blinked rapidly as sweat dripped down her brow, stinging her eyes. The altitude number continued dropping. They were still descending, but she could control the angle enough to avoid a catastrophic dive. If she kept this up, she might stabilize at a safer altitude, where the air was thicker and control more responsive. But she couldn't do that without help. The radio crackled again, this time slightly clearer. Ghost Sparrow, repeat, who is flying the aircraft? She leaned closer, pressing the transmit button with trembling fingers. My name is Aria. I'm 13. The pilots aren't moving. I have manual control but the engines are unstable and the descent isn't stopping. There was a long silence. Too long. Then the voice returned, calmer this time, attempting to remain composed. Aria, listen carefully. You're doing an incredible job. We're going to help you. Just stay calm and keep the aircraft steady. Her chest tightened at the reassurance. She needed those words more than she realized. But the radio signal wasn't strong. It faded again, leaving her alone in the echoing whine of struggling engines. She stared through the cockpit windshield. The horizon was starting to tilt again. She corrected it. Slight pressure. Small adjustments. The Ghost Sparrow responded, slower than it should, rougher than she expected, but it responded. Her muscles burned from the tension of holding the yoke steady. She felt every vibration, every pull, every moment of resistance. The aircraft felt alive, injured, panicked, but still fighting with her, not against her. Aria swallowed hard. Okay, we can do this, she whispered to herself. Just like the simulator. Just bigger. Much, much bigger. She checked the altitude again. The descent was finally slowing to a manageable rate. They were still dropping, but she had stopped the freefall. Now she needed a plan. She needed to stabilize the engines, regain control of the left wing, level the aircraft, and somehow get it down to a lower altitude where the controls would respond better. Then she would need to prepare for landing, if the engines held long enough. If the hydraulic systems didn't fail. If she didn't make a critical mistake. Her pulse thundered in her ears. But she pushed every fear aside, focusing only on the next 5 seconds. Then the next 5. Then the next. She adjusted the trim, centering the yoke slightly. The plane stabilized more. She eased the throttle of the stable engine while monitoring the overheating one. Every second, she made tiny corrections the way she had practiced so many times in simulations. But this time, there were no do-overs. A warning light began to blink, cabin pressure low. She gritted her teeth. One problem at a time, please. The aircraft shook violently again, as if reminding her that it wasn't done fighting. Aria pressed her feet into the pedals and used all her strength to keep the nose from dipping. The plane bucked like a wild horse. She held on. She wouldn't let go. The engines roared. The controls resisted. The alarms screamed. And still, she maintained control. Slowly, painfully, against the weight of gravity and machinery and fear, she steadied the Ghost Sparrow. A 13-year-old girl, alone, in a failing aircraft high above the earth, fighting to keep hundreds of souls alive. Her breathing steadied. Her hands stopped shaking. Her eyes focused, sharper than ever before. She was in control. And she wouldn't let the plane fall. Wind tore across the jet's frame like claws dragging against metal, each gust shaking the Ghost Sparrow harder than the last as it dropped from the edge of the stratosphere. Outside the cockpit windows, the world blurred into streaks of white and black, clouds swirling like violent whirlpools as the aircraft descended far too fast for safety. The thin air at this altitude offered almost no resistance, making every movement, every tilt, every correction twice as difficult. Aria's small hands gripped the yoke with all the strength she had, her knuckles pale beneath the leather gloves she wore. Her arms trembled from effort, but her eyes, focused, unwavering, remained locked on the displays. The entire cockpit glowed red, warning lights pulsing in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat made of danger. Engine failure flashed across the engine display in bold, unforgiving letters. Hydraulic pressure low blinked beside a pressure gauge that was dropping faster than the altitude. Cabin temp critical glowed ominously as the temperature readings spiked and fell in erratic patterns, indicators that something within the internal airflow systems was failing too. The entire aircraft felt like a machine collapsing piece by piece. Aria felt the yoke fight against her hands again, pulling to the left, the dying left engine creating a drag imbalance that wanted to twist the aircraft into a spin. She countered it with pressure on the right pedal, her right leg burning from how hard she had to push. Her breathing sounded loud inside her oxygen mask, each breath fast, unsteady, but she forced herself to remain calm. She remembered her father's voice. Planes are big, but they're obedient. If you stay calm, they'll listen to you. But you must be calmer than the plane. She forced her breath to slow. Outside the left window, she saw the dull orange glow of the overheating engine. It flickered, dimmed, then flared again as the failing components struggled to survive the brutal descent. She knew engines were not supposed to glow like that. She knew, even without advanced training, that this engine was about to give up. The altimeter spun downward. The vertical speed indicator needle was deep into the negative zone, warning her that the aircraft was still dropping at a rate much faster than survivable. Aria tightened her grip and pulled slightly back on the yoke, easing the nose upward. The aircraft responded with a deep groaning noise, the metal frame protesting under the strain. For a terrifying half-second, she thought the wings might snap. But then the aircraft stabilized, barely, but enough to slow their descent by a small margin. Every meter she gained was a victory. Every meter she lost was a reminder of how close they were to disaster. Her radio crackled with static. For a moment, nothing but hiss filled the cockpit. Then a voice broke through, faint, jittery, but human. "Ghost Sparrow, this is air traffic control. Repeat your status. Who is controlling the aircraft?" She pressed the transmit button with her thumb, her voice strained. It's Aria. The pilots are unconscious. The plane is falling. One engine is failing. I have manual control." There was a long pause. Too long. She imagined the control center on the ground, adults staring wide-eyed at the monitors, unable to comprehend that a child sat in the captain's seat of a massive aircraft holding hundreds of lives in her hands. Then the controller spoke again, slower this time. "Aria, just keep it steady. We're here with you." Aria didn't answer. She couldn't. Every second, every thought, every fiber of her attention was locked on the controls. Talking felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her world had narrowed to the shaking metal around her, the flashing lights, and the relentless drop of numbers on the screen. The aircraft shook hard again, sending a rattling sound through the cockpit. Something metallic scraped from beneath the floor. Aria flinched but kept her hands firm. The turbulence grew rougher, the air becoming thicker and more chaotic as they dropped into denser atmosphere. The pressure slammed against the fuselage like repeated blows, the plane vibrating with an intensity she had never experienced even in the most realistic simulators. She checked the hydraulic system again. The pressure gauge needle hovered dangerously close to zero. Hydraulic power controlled the flaps, the brakes, the landing gear, everything essential for landing. If the hydraulics failed completely, she would have almost nothing but raw muscle and luck to bring this giant machine down safely. The right engine coughed, sputtered, then steadied again. The left engine's warning lights blazed brighter. Its temperature rose past safety limits. She reduced throttle on the failing engine, trying to cool it, but the temperature only dropped slightly. The airflow must have been disrupted. It was dying, and she needed it. The nose dipped again as the failing engine dragged the aircraft down. She corrected it quickly, her hands burning with the effort. The aircraft groaned but obeyed, leveling slightly. She kept her eyes locked forward. She had no time to look at the unconscious pilots behind her, though she felt their presence like shadows, reminders of everything that was suddenly her responsibility. Another alarm shrieked, this one even more urgent. Stall warning. Her heart jumped. A stall at this altitude would mean the aircraft losing lift entirely. It would drop like a stone, entering an uncontrollable dive. She pushed the nose slightly down to regain airflow over the wings. The stall warning stopped, but now the descent rate increased again. Her stomach twisted. She was balancing on the edge of two disasters. Too slow and she would stall, too fast and she would dive. The radio crackled again. "Aria, listen carefully. We're tracking your descent rate. You're doing extremely well. Keep your movements small and controlled. The plane is responding to you." She didn't respond. Her hands were numb. She blinked sweat away from her eyes. The cockpit lights flickered, the electrical system straining under the failing hydraulics. The aircraft hit a pocket of turbulent air. The wings shook violently. A deep bang echoed from somewhere in the fuselage. Loose papers flew across the cockpit. Aria's grip nearly slipped, but she tightened her hands around the yoke until her fingers hurt. "You're okay," she whispered to herself. "You're okay. Just a little more." The descent rate began to slow again. The altimeter numbers still fell, but not as fast. She could feel the air outside growing denser, the plane responding just a little more to her movements. For the first time since entering the cockpit, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. Then everything went wrong again. The left engine erupted in a burst of sparks. A puff of smoke blew past the window. The engine RPM dropped sharply. The warning display flashed. Engine 2 shutdown imminent. Aria's chest tightened. No, no, no. She reduced throttle completely on that engine, trying to avoid a total shutdown. But the temperature kept rising, the pressure dropping. She had minutes, maybe less, before the engine died. The plane tilted hard toward the failing side. She fought it, pushing the opposite rudder pedal with all her strength. Her leg ached. Her arms burned. But she refused to lose control. The radio voice returned, softer now. Aria, we see the engine readings. You need to prepare for single-engine flight. You can do this. Just keep it steady. She still said nothing. Her jaw was clenched, teeth pressing together so hard it hurt. The aircraft shook again, another shuddering jolt that rattled every panel. She steadied the yoke, her breath shaky, her eyes burning with focus. The stall warning blared again. She corrected it. The hydraulic warning beeped. She adjusted pressure. The cabin temperature warning burst into life. She checked airflow management. She was flying this plane with every piece of knowledge her father had ever given her. The altimeter continued dropping. 11,000 meters. 10,000. 9,000. She needed to reach safer air, thicker air, where the aircraft would behave more predictably. Her arms trembled. Her spine hurt. Every muscle in her body screamed. But she held on. The Ghost Sparrow roared, groaned, shuddered, but stayed alive. The plane was hurt, broken, gasping for mechanical breath, but it listened to her. Aria felt something inside her shift. A realization. She wasn't just keeping the plane alive. The plane was keeping her alive too. They were surviving together. Her breathing steadied again as she forced her body to stay calm, to stay strong. She kept her hands on the yoke, her feet on the pedals, and her eyes flickering across every display, every number. The descent finally slowed. The altimeter ticked down more gently, moving less like a waterfall and more like a slow slide. The engines roared unevenly, but one still worked. The hydraulics were low but functional. She had control, fragile, temporary, full of risk, but control. And for the first time since she sat in the cockpit, the thought crossed her mind. She might actually save them. She tightened her grip once more, leaning forward, eyes fierce. She wasn't done fighting. Breaking through the thick layer of clouds, Aria finally saw it. The faint, silver streak of the runway cutting through the landscape far below. It looked impossibly small from the altitude she was descending through, more like a thin strip of metal than a safe place to land. The Ghost Sparrow shuddered violently as high-altitude winds hammered the fuselage. The aircraft was falling faster than it should, a wounded giant struggling to stay airborne. Still, Aria kept her eyes fixed on that single lifeline, refusing to blink, refusing to let fear take the controls from her hands. The cockpit was filled with alarms screaming in her ears, red lights flashing in sharp, frantic rhythms. One particular warning light blazed brighter than anything else. She looked toward the engine status display just in time to see it happen. The left engine exploded in a burst of fire that lit up the horizon. The entire aircraft lurched sideways from the sudden loss of thrust and the shock wave that punched through the engine bay. A burst of flame trailed behind the wing before breaking apart in the wind and dissipating into the clouds. Smoke smothered the left side, darkening the sky outside the cockpit windows. Inside the cabin, terrified screams echoed. The floor vibrated. Loose objects rattled. Somewhere behind her, someone prayed out loud. Another person sobbed uncontrollably. The Ghost Sparrow was no longer flying so much as tumbling forward, held in the sky by desperation and the remaining engine fighting for its life. But inside the cockpit, Aria didn't flinch. Her face was pale, her hair sticking to her forehead with sweat, her small hands gripping the controls with a level of determination that no adult could have predicted. Her breathing was uneven, but her focus never wavered. She had practiced emergency landings before, on simulators, in her father's small training cockpit, and even in VR flight scenarios he had set up at home. But this wasn't simulation. This was a burning, shaking, colossal aircraft with 300 lives depending on her. It was a plane built for experienced pilots, not a girl whose feet barely reached the rudder pedals. And yet she moved with precision, shifting her weight forward, adjusting the throttle of the lone functioning engine, gently pushing the yoke to counter the violent roll that threatened to send the jet into a death spiral. Air traffic control kept calling her name, their voices urgent, frantic, struggling to stay calm. They had already realized she was just a child. The entire control tower had gone dead silent except for the sound of her shallow breathing coming over the radio. Aria, the runway is yours. Just keep it steady. You can do this, one controller repeated, his voice shaking. But Aria didn't answer. She couldn't. Every ounce of energy she had was going into keeping the aircraft level. One wrong movement, one moment of hesitation, and 300 souls would fall from the sky. The altimeter spun rapidly as the plane continued its descent. Aria fought against gravity and panic, using every bit of training she remembered. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Steady hands. Always look ahead. Trust the instruments. Breathe. She exhaled slowly, her trembling fingers tightening on the controls as she lined up the nose of the Ghost Sparrow with the distant runway. The aircraft was still too high, too fast, too damaged. The left wing dipped dangerously. She pulled back, adjusting the flaps despite the warning lights that told her the hydraulics were seconds away from total failure. The runway grew clearer, larger, more real with each passing second. She could make out the painted lines, the emergency vehicles racing into position, the lights guiding her toward safety. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, keeping herself grounded in the moment. The burning left engine continued spitting embers into the air, every flicker a reminder of how little time she had left. The right engine strained under the pressure, whining louder and louder until it sounded like it might rip itself apart. But it held. As she approached the landing path, she felt the aircraft sinking too quickly. The yoke felt heavier, resisting her, fighting against her strength. She wasn't strong enough. At least, that's what every adult watching from the ground believed. But Aria dug deep, her arms shaking violently as she pulled with every bit of force she could muster. Her cry of effort was swallowed by the roar of the wind blasting against the cockpit. The landing gear needed to come down, but timing was everything. Too early and the plane could collapse on impact. Too late and they'd smash belly first into the ground. Flames whipped across the left side of the aircraft as she waited for the right moment, counting the seconds under her breath the way her father had taught her. When she finally reached the number she trusted, she hit the gear lever. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Warning lights exploded across the panel. The hydraulic system was moments from total shutdown. She hit the lever again, harder this time, praying the backup mechanism would still respond. The plane dipped. The runway raced toward them. Then suddenly, with a metallic groan that vibrated the entire cockpit, the landing gear dropped into place. The indicator lights flickered from red to green. She had one chance. The ground rushed toward them with terrifying speed. The nose came down too sharply and she adjusted instinctively, angling the aircraft just enough to prevent a catastrophic impact. The left engine, still burning, scraped the air like a dying creature. The aircraft shrieked as it hit the runway, the wheels slamming down with enough force to throw Aria forward against her harness. Sparks exploded beneath the fuselage, bright enough to pierce through the thick smoke. Passengers were thrown in their seats, the sound of screeching metal filling the cabin like a thunderstorm. The Ghost Sparrow bounced once, twice, each time threatening to veer off the runway. Aria gritted her teeth and held the yoke steady, fighting the pull of the dead engine trying to drag them sideways. Her arms ached, her chest hurt, but she didn't loosen her grip. The plane slid across the runway, leaving a trail of glowing sparks behind it. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, ready for the worst. Oxygen masks swung wildly from the overhead compartments. People held hands, cried, screamed, prayed. The jet slowed agonizingly, inch by inch, until at last the shuddering motion faded. The burning engine coughed one final burst of smoke before dying completely. Silence fell. For several seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal. Then, somewhere in the cabin, a single voice broke the stillness, a gasp, followed by a sob of relief. Another screamed joyfully. Someone shouted, someone laughed in disbelief. The aircraft erupted with cheers, cries, applause, and the overwhelming sound of 300 hearts realizing they were still beating. In the cockpit, Aria's hands slipped off the controls. Her entire body shook with exhaustion, adrenaline crashing down like a wave. Tears spilled freely now, falling onto her lap as she leaned forward, chest heaving. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't even feel like she had done something extraordinary. She just felt tired, tired and grateful that the nightmare was over. The cockpit door burst open behind her. Flight attendants rushed in, eyes wide, mouths trembling with shock as they saw her, the small girl in the pilot's seat, barely big enough to fill it, trembling but alive, having just done the impossible. One of them covered her mouth in disbelief. Another knelt down beside her, speaking softly, telling her she was safe, telling her she had saved everyone. Outside, passengers were guided off the plane, many of them still crying, some looking back toward the cockpit with awe. Word spread quickly across the runway, across the airport, across the city. Emergency responders stood frozen when they heard the truth. A 13-year-old girl had just landed one of the world's most advanced aircraft with one engine destroyed, the hydraulics failing, and the entire jet moments away from falling out of the sky. Cameras began gathering, news alerts pinged across devices worldwide, and disbelief turned into admiration. Reporters stared at the towering aircraft, stunned by the skid marks that stretched across the runway like scars. Pilots watching from the terminal shook their heads in amazement. Many had never survived landings with this level of system failure. Yet a child had brought it down safely. Aria eventually stepped out of the cockpit, supported gently by the flight attendant. The passengers standing near the front burst into applause the moment they saw her. Some bowed their heads. Some reached out to touch her shoulder in gratitude. Others whispered prayers of thanks. She looked around, overwhelmed, unsure how to react. She had always dreamed of flying, always believed she'd become a pilot someday, but she had never imagined her first real landing would save hundreds of lives. Her legs felt weak as she walked down the aisle, escorted by emergency personnel. Every face she passed held shock and gratitude. Mothers held their children closer. Elderly passengers wiped tears from their cheeks. People who had thought they were moments away from death now stared at her with reverence. When she finally stepped out onto the runway, the sunlight hit her face, and for the first time since the emergency began, she took a deep, full breath. The air smelled of jet fuel, smoke, and rain. Fire trucks sprayed foam over the damaged left engine. Medics rushed past her. Reporters snapped photos from behind barriers. But all she saw was the wide open sky above her, the same sky she had fallen through, fought through, survived. A single thought drifted through her mind. She had saved them. A 13-year-old had saved everyone on board. And the world would never forget the name Aria, the girl who refused to let fear win, the girl who flew through fire and chaos, the girl who brought the Ghost Sparrow home.